She thought her voice was louder than the law, but in Judge Caprio's courtroom, she learned that silence can speak louder than arrogance. What happens when the world's most patient judge meets a woman who refuses to stop talking? You're about to find out. That morning in Providence began like so many others in my courtroom. Quiet, predictable, and filled with the soft rhythm of daily justice. Parking violations, minor speeding tickets, a few noise complaints, the usual civic choreography that defines a Tuesday morning in the municipal court. I have always believed that every person who walks through those doors deserves to be treated with patience, dignity, and understanding. But on that morning, I didn't yet realize that my patience would be tested more than it had been in years. As I looked over the list of cases, one name caught my eye. Karen Whitfield, age 42. 65 miles per hour in a 35-mile-per-hour zone through a school district. A serious infraction, certainly, but nothing out of the ordinary. The officer's notes, however, made me pause. Argumentative at the scene, refused to accept citation gracefully. I've seen thousands of cases over the decades, and you begin to recognize patterns in human behavior. Some people come humbled, ready to explain and learn. Others arrive defensive, convinced the world has treated them unfairly. Still others, a rare few, come armed with a sense of entitlement so strong that even the gavel can't silence it. I had a feeling Miss Whitfield might fall into that third category. The courtroom was modestly filled that morning. About 20 people waiting quietly for their turn. Mrs. Rodriguez, a kind older woman, sat patiently clutching her parking paperwork. 3 college students whispered nervously in the back about their noise complaint. Officer Thompson, who had written the speeding ticket, was present, seated near the rear. Even from where I sat, I could see a look on his face that said, "You're about to see something, Judge," at 10:20 a.m. The bailiff called the next case. A case of the city of Providence versus Karen Whitfield. The courtroom doors opened, and in walked a woman who carried herself like she was late for a board meeting rather than a court hearing. Perfectly tailored business suit, designer handbag, every hair in place. She was the image of confidence, or perhaps overconfidence. She didn't glance at anyone in the gallery. She didn't need to. Her expression suggested she had far more important things to do than deal with a speeding ticket. I greeted her as I greet everyone. "Good morning, Miss Whitfield. You're here regarding a speeding citation issued on Elmwood Avenue." She cut in immediately. "Your Honor, I need to explain something right away. That speed limit sign is completely hidden by branches. The city needs to maintain it better. Now, I've been interrupted before. It happens. But there was a certain energy about this interruption that was different. I could feel the temperature in the room change ever so slightly. I looked up from my papers, met her eyes, and said as gently as I could, "Miss Whitfield, I understand you have concerns, but if you would please..." Again, she spoke over me. "Your Honor, I pay over $18,000 a year in property taxes, and I think that gives me the right to expect properly maintained signage." Around us, I noticed the subtle reactions. Officer Thompson lowering his head, the stenographer's fingers pausing on the keys, the quiet shuffle of the gallery as people leaned forward. They sensed the storm gathering before even I did. I tried once more. "Ma'am, I'll give you the opportunity to explain, but please allow me to finish my introduction." She launched into another monologue about a bureaucratic inefficiency and a revenue-driven enforcement. Her words rolled out fast, precise, and relentless, the way a realtor might pitch a stubborn client. It was clear that silence for her was not an option. After years on this bench, you learn to read people. Karen Whitfield wasn't simply angry. She was performing. She was used to control, used to rooms that bent to her voice, clients who hesitated under her pressure. Negotiations where persistence equaled victory. Yay. But my courtroom isn't a negotiation table. It's a place of balance where words have weight only when they're spoken with respect. By the 4th interruption, I quietly set down my pen. By the 5th, I leaned back in my chair. By the 7th, I could feel my patience thinning. Not from disappointment. It's one thing to argue a point. It's another to disregard the very foundation of order. Finally, as she began citing a constitutional grounds for hidden street signs, I said just one word, a stop. It wasn't loud, but it carried through the room like a crack of thunder. The entire courtroom froze. Even the faint hum of the ceiling fan seemed to pause. Ms. Whitfield blinked, stunned that someone had dared interrupt her. I rose from the bench slowly. At 77, my movements are deliberate, and looked directly at her. Whitfield, I said evenly, you have been in my courtroom for exactly 4 minutes, and you've interrupted me 7 times. Her jaw tightened. Your Honor, I was simply trying to... 8 times, I said. A ripple went through the gallery. A few gasps, a quiet chuckle stifled quickly. I wasn't trying to embarrass her, but I needed her to understand the gravity of what was happening. This is not a debate, I continued. This is a court of law. Here, I speak first so I can understand your case. Listen so I can hear your side and turn. If you cannot do that, this process falls apart. For a moment, she was silent. The first silence since she'd entered. But her expression told me the lesson hadn't yet settled. She was waiting for her next opening, preparing another barrage. As I resumed the docket summary, she opened her mouth again. Your Honor, with all due respect. 9, I said quietly. The room fell silent once more. At that instant, I realized this wasn't just about us. It was about something much larger, about how easily power and privilege can make us forget the simplest of courtesies. And as I looked at her, frustrated, fuming, yet beginning to realize the limits of her voice, I knew the morning ahead would become not a trial about traffic law, but a lesson in humility. That was the moment the real case began. Not the one written on the citation, but the one unfolding in her heart. When you sit on the bench long enough, you begin to see that true authority isn't about volume. It's about presence. It's not how loudly you speak that earns respect. It's how calmly you hold it. That morning, as Karen Whitfield stood before me, I realized we were about to test that truth to its limit. She stood there, arms crossed, confidence radiating from her posture, the way someone used to being in control often does. I could tell she wasn't used to being told to stop. The kind of person who speaks first, listens last, and believes that silence means weakness. But silence in a courtroom can be the most powerful voice of all. I picked up my papers again, not because I needed to read them, but to give her and the room a moment to breathe. Ms. Whitfield, I said finally, you may now speak respectfully and without interruption. It was my small gesture of fairness, the same courtesy I extend to every person who stands before me. She nodded, though her nod carried a faint defiance. Your Honor, she began, with all due respect, I think this entire citation's unfair. The signage is obstructed. The officer could have given me a warning. I'm a taxpayer and a law-abiding citizen, not some reckless driver. It's absurd to treat responsible people this way. Her tone carried the sharp precision of someone who negotiates for a living. Every word calculated, every pause deliberate, but beneath her practiced rhetoric, I could hear something else, an echo of entitlement. Ms. Whitfield, I said softly, the issue before this court is not your tax record. It's whether or not you exceeded the posted speed limit in a school zone. She exhaled sharply, dismissively. That's exactly my point, Your Honor. I can't be held accountable for poor city maintenance. She went on and on, spinning theories about hidden signs, municipal negligence, and liability exposure. At one point, I glanced toward Officer Thompson, who sat expressionless, though I could see a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. He'd seen this before. Maybe not this level of persistence, but the same pattern of misplaced confidence. I let her finish. It took nearly 3 minutes, but eventually I waited another beat before speaking. Ms. Whitfield, I said, would you like to know what I heard? Her brow furrowed. Excuse me? I heard, I said evenly, that you believe your professional success and civic contributions entitle you to bend the rules, that you see this courtroom as an inconvenience rather than an institution, and most of all, that you've mistaken persistence for respect. The silence that followed was palpable. Palpable, even the faint hum of the courtroom light seemed to grow louder. She shifted slightly, caught off guard. I didn't mean 10 times, I said, interrupting her, though my tone was measured, not mocking. At least 10 interruptions this morning. Her cheeks flushed, the bright pink of embarrassment creeping through her practiced composure. Your Honor, I wasn't counting. I said. And I assure you everyone else in this room was too. Behind her, I could hear Mrs. Rodriguez murmur softly to herself, perhaps a prayer for patience. For both of us. The college students, their eyes wide, seemed to be witnessing something far more educational than their university lectures. I stood again, slowly, deliberately. Ms. Whitfield, this is not a boardroom. You cannot negotiate the terms of respect here. You cannot outtalk the law. Every time you enter, tell this court, and everyone watching, that your voice matters more than theirs. That is not how justice works. She pressed her lips together. It was the first time I'd seen her hesitate. Her voice dropped slightly when she said, I was only trying to explain my side, and I want to hear it, I replied. But I cannot hear anything from someone who refuses to stop talking long enough to listen. Listening is not silence, Miss Whitfield. It's understanding. It's what separates justice from chaos. For a moment, she looked at me, genuinely unsure what to do. The rhythm she'd relied on, control through words, ominous through speech, no longer worked here. I softened my tone. You may be a skilled negotiator, Miss Whitfield. I can see that you built a successful career on being assertive. But there's a difference between confidence and arrogance. Confidence respects others. Arrogance erases them. She didn't reply. For the first time, her silence wasn't defiance. It was reflection. I could almost see her recalibrating, realizing that the tools she used in business were useless in this courtroom. Let me be clear, I continued. This court isn't here to humiliate you. It's here to remind you and everyone else that rules exist for a reason. Respect is not optional. Order is not negotiable. And authority, when exercised properly, is not about control. It's about fairness. That's a serious matter, far more serious than a speeding ticket. You're walking a very fine line. She swallowed hard, her confidence beginning to crack. Your Honor, I didn't mean any disrespect. I nodded slowly. Then show it. Words are easy. Respect is action. And then I paused, not for her, but for the lesson itself to sink in. Every person in that courtroom was learning it with her. Respect isn't about bowing or obeying. It's about acknowledging that every voice deserves its moment to be heard, but not at the expense of others. After a long silence, I said quietly, we'll continue this case after I've addressed the next matter. In the meantime, I'd ask you to remain seated, observe, and consider the difference between being heard and being right. As I turned to the next case, I could see a reflection in the polished wood of the bench, no longer rigid, but uncertain. For perhaps the first time in years, Karen Whitfield wasn't controlling the room. And for the first time, she was beginning to live. We're cited for going 42 miles per hour in a 25 zone, I said. A school zone at 8:10 a.m., she nodded. Yes, Your Honor. I was running late for a client meeting. I didn't see the flashing lights. The children were crossing the street, I said softly. That's what this law protects. Her expression faltered. I didn't realize. No one does, I said, until they do. There it was, the turning point. Not a confession of guilt, but an awakening. I've seen it hundreds of times. The moment when the scales shift from defense to reflection. When a person stops fighting the law and starts understanding why it exists, I lean forward. You see, Miss Whitfield, the law doesn't care about your title, your wealth, or your resume. Only asks for responsibility starts with humility. She nodded again, slower this time. You're right, Your Honor. I've spent so much time trying to be right, I forgot what it means to be accountable. It was quiet after that, the kind of quiet that doesn't need to be filled. The courtroom wasn't watching a punishment unfold. It was watching transformation. I finally said, as I'm Whitfield, I'm not here to break your pride. I'm here to remind you that every person, no matter how powerful, has an obligation to respect the same rules that protect the powerless. That's how justice stays just. She lowered her head. Because understanding is the beginning of change. Now, I could find you the full amount, or I could give you something better. An opportunity to show that your respect isn't just spoken, but practiced. Her eyebrows lifted slightly. What do you mean? I'll explain soon, I said. But first, I want you to listen to one more case. I motioned for the clerk to bring up the next defendant. A young man, no more than 20, cited for reckless driving. 20 years, 20 years. 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 20 ye She wasn't preparing to argue. She was learning, and in that quiet act of listening, something remarkable was happening. For perhaps the first time in a long, successful, and unyielding career, Karen Whitfield, the woman who couldn't stop talking, had finally found the wisdom in silence. That was the real turning point, not in her case, but in her character. And from that moment forward, I knew the next decision I made wouldn't just settle a fine, it would restore something far more important. There's a saying I often repeat to young lawyers and to the people who appear before me. Justice doesn't always mean punishment. Sometimes it means perspective. And that morning, as I sat in my courtroom looking at Miss Karen Whitfield, I knew that this was one of those moments when perspective could do more good than any fine ever would. She sat quietly now, hands folded, eyes steady, a far cry from the defiant woman who had first walked through those doors believing the world revolved around her schedule. I took a deep breath and let the silence fill the room before I spoke. Whitfield, I began, I've listened carefully to your words today, and I've watched how you've listened to others. That change alone tells me you're capable of growth. But understanding without action is like a seed never planted. It doesn't grow into anything real. She nodded respectfully. Yes, Your Honor. You've built a successful business, I continued, and I admire that. It takes grit, discipline, and sacrifice. But in this courtroom, I measure success differently. Here, success isn't about how high you've climbed, it's about how grounded you remain once you're up there. For a moment, she seemed unsure whether to respond. Her instinct, the one that had made her a fighter in boardrooms and negotiations, wanted to defend. But this wasn't a boardroom, and she knew it, so she stayed silent. That silence told me she was finally ready to learn. And Miss Whitfield, I said gently, you were cited for speeding in a school zone. You've acknowledged it, and that's the right first step. But what concerns me more than your speed was your initial attitude, your belief that your success somehow placed you above responsibility. That belief is dangerous, not only on the road, but in life. Her eyes tightening just slightly, I leaned forward. You see, when people reach a certain level of comfort or achievement, they often start mistaking privilege for permission. They think the rules apply to everyone else, until they find themselves standing here, realizing that justice doesn't care about your net worth. I paused for a moment, looking around the courtroom. The law is the great equalizer. It doesn't ask how much money you have. It only asks, did you act responsibly? The room was silent. Even the usual whispering among spectators had faded away. I turned my gaze back to her. Now, I could fine you the maximum amount for this violation. Given your record, I'd be justified in doing so. But that wouldn't teach you anything, except that you can pay your way out of mistakes. And I think, today, you've already started to realize that some lessons are worth more than money. She nodded slowly. I think you're right, Your Honor. I know I am, I said, smiling faintly. So instead of just imposing a fine, I'm going to give you something more meaningful. Her eyes lifted, curious. I'm ordering you, I said, to spend one day, just one, volunteering at the very elementary school near where you were cited. You'll assist with their community safety program. You'll meet the children who walk those streets you sped through, and you'll see with your own eyes why that flashing sign matters. There was a collective murmur in the courtroom. People weren't expecting that verdict. Neither was she. Honor, she said softly, you mean I have to go there? You'll go there. You'll talk to the principal. You'll see those kids running around, laughing, playing. And when you do, I hope you'll understand something that no amount of success can buy, the responsibility that comes with being part of a community. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then she nodded. I'll do it. I think I need to do it. That answer, that simple admission, was more valuable than any check she could have written to this court. I continued, in addition, you'll pay a reduced fine of $100 and provide proof of your community service within 30 days. If you do that, this case will be closed. But more importantly, I hope it will be resolved, not just in the system, but within you. She smiled faintly. I understand, Your Honor. Thank you for giving me the chance to make it right. I nodded. You're welcome. But remember, Ms. Whitfield, this isn't just about making it right with the court. It's about making it right with your... The gavel came down softly, not as a strike of punishment, but as a note of closure. As she gathered her things and prepared to leave, I saw something different in her eyes. Not defeat, but humility. A kind of quiet reflection that said she just experienced something deeper than a hearing. She'd experienced a reckoning. Before she walked out, she turned back and said, Your Honor, I'll remember this. I smiled. After she left, my bailiff leaned toward me and said, Judge, I think that one's going to change. I smiled faintly. I hope so, I said. Because sometimes the best verdict isn't about guilt or innocence. It's about rediscovering humanity. That's the thing about justice. People think it lives in the rules, the codes, the fines, but it really lives in moments like that when pride bends just enough to let wisdom in. And as I sat there preparing for the next case, I couldn't help but think maybe that's the real definition of success. Not the wealth we earn, but the grace we learn. There's something powerful about silence, the kind that follows a person's awakening. When Miss Karen Whitfield walked out of my courtroom that morning, I could tell her silence was different. It wasn't the defiant quiet of someone planning their next argument. It was the silence of a person who had finally started listening to herself. 3 weeks later, a letter arrived at my office. It was handwritten, rare in our modern world, on thick stationery embossed with her company's logo. The first line made me smile. Your Honor, I spent my day at Roosevelt Elementary School, and I don't think I'll ever look at a speed limit sign the same way again. I remember setting the letter down and leaning back in my chair, already knowing that this was going to be one of those stories that stays with me. She described arriving at the school that morning, nervous, uncertain, almost embarrassed. The principal had welcomed her warmly, already aware of the circumstances. You must be the lady Judge Caprio sent, the principal had said kindly. Karen had been assigned to help with the school's morning safety patrol, guiding children across the street and reminding parents to slow down in the drop-off zone. She wrote that at first she felt out of place. Her business suit traded for jeans and a safety vest. Her phone tucked away for once. But as she stood by the crosswalk holding that bright orange stop sign, she began to see the world differently. She wrote, Your Honor, those kids, they were running, laughing, living life without fear. Every car that slowed down wasn't just following a rule, it was protecting something precious. And then came the part that truly struck me. Around 8:15, a silver SUV came flying around the corner, barely braking at the crossing. For a split second, I saw myself behind that wheel, rushing, impatient, justifying it because I was important. That moment hit me harder than your gavel ever could. She went on to explain how, throughout the day, she listened to the teachers, the crossing guards, and the parents. She saw how much effort the community put into keeping those children safe. How many little acts of patience and cooperation made the system work. By lunchtime, she'd stopped checking her watch. By afternoon, she was laughing with the kids, helping them hold signs that read as slow down. We love our school. And at the end of the day, she said, one little girl tugged on her vest and asked, Are you the lady who was speeding by our school? Karen admitted she was. The little girl just smiled and said, That's okay. You're helping now. When I read that line, I'll admit, I had to take a moment. Because that's what true justice is supposed to do. It doesn't just punish mistakes, it redeems them. It turns a moment of arrogance into a lifetime of awareness. A few days later, Karen appeared back in my courtroom with her proof of service. But this time, everything about her was different. Her voice was calm, her posture composed, her tone humble. Your Honor, she said, I completed my assignment, but it became more than that. I realized that my entire approach to life and business has been wrong. I built success by talking over people, but what I learned at that school is that listening, really listening, creates trust, respect, and connection. Those kids taught me more in one day than I've learned in 15 years of running a company. I did slowly, letting her words sink in not just for her, but for everyone in that courtroom who needed to hear them. Whitfield, I said, I believe you've learned something that no fine or penalty could ever teach. You've rediscovered what success is really about. Responsibility, empathy, and respect. She smiled softly. You were right, Your Honor. Success isn't about how much you win. It's about how much good you leave behind. The courtroom was silent for a moment. Even the stenographer had paused her typing, perhaps realizing she was witnessing something rare. Not just a verdict, but a transformation. I closed her case that day with a simple statement. Ms. Whitfield, your case is dismissed in full recognition of your service and your growth. But more importantly, I want you to leave here today knowing that redemption isn't given, it's earned. You earned it. She thanked me, her voice steady but emotional. Your Honor, she said, I used to think power was about speaking louder than everyone else. Now I understand it's about knowing when to be quiet. That, right there, was her real victory. A few months later, I received another message, this time from one of her employees. It read, Judge, I don't know what happened in that courtroom, but Karen has changed everything about how she runs our office. She listens to everyone now. She even started a scholarship fund for students in the same district where she was cited. She says it's to remind her to slow down. In every sense. When I read that, I couldn't help but smile. The echo of change doesn't fade easily when it's built on humility. Sometimes people ask me why I go easy on defendants who show remorse. I tell them this. Punishment alone rarely changes hearts. Compassion paired with accountability can move mountains. Karen Whitfield came into my courtroom believing she was untouchable. A woman defined by her title, her success, and her certainty. She left understanding that the greatest title any of us can hold is simply a decent human being. And that's the real miracle of justice, not the power to judge, but the opportunity to transform.